The moment I sat down at that Thanksgiving table, my mother looked at me the way she always did when she had already made up her mind. She pushed a document toward me and said, "Your little sister needs him more than you do. You're the older one, you'll find someone else. She won't survive losing him." Shelby was already crying. The door behind me had already been closed. Someone had already taken my phone. And my father sat at the head of the table with a stack of papers in front of him, not once meeting my eyes. They had spent weeks building this trap. Every aunt, every uncle, every cousin in that room had been told a version of this story, a version where I was the villain and Shelby was the victim. So I stopped waiting for permission to defend myself. I reached into my bag and set my grandmother's locked wooden box on the table. My mother's face went completely white. She knew exactly what was inside. If you've ever been told that being the older one means giving up everything, stay with me. And if this kind of story speaks to you, consider subscribing. I share new ones every week. I grew up believing that being the older sister was a privilege. My grandmother Beatrice was the one who told me that she'd say it while walking me through the corridors of Harborstone Inn, pointing out the crown molding she'd commissioned in the 1950s, the brass fixtures she'd polished by hand every Sunday. She wanted me to feel connected to the place, to understand that the inn wasn't just a building, but something living, something that required care and attention, and someone willing to put it before themselves. I took that seriously. Looking back now, I think I took it far too seriously and for far too long. Shelby never walked those corridors the same way. She'd drift through the lobby in whatever was fashionable that season, charming guests, laughing too loudly, and disappearing before anyone could hand her a responsibility. Our mother Patricia watched Shelby do this and called it personality. She watched me stay behind, sent to finish the work, and called it strength. What she never said, what I didn't understand until much later, was that she had decided somewhere along the way that my strength existed specifically to absorb whatever Shelby couldn't handle. When we were children, if Shelby broke something, I was asked why I hadn't been watching her. If she skipped school, I was expected to have talked her out of it. If we both wanted the same thing, the last piece of dessert, a window seat on a road trip, a dress we saw in a store window, my mother would look at me and say, "You're the older one." That was the whole sentence. That was the whole argument. I was the older one, and that meant the thing belonged to Shelby by default. I learned to stop wanting things out loud, because wanting something out loud only meant watching it get handed to my sister, while I was praised for being mature enough to let it go. My father Raymond was quieter about it. He wasn't cruel the way my mother could be. He was more like a man who had decided that the path of least resistance was the only path worth walking. He saw what was happening. I know he did because there were moments when he'd catch my eye across the dinner table and look away too quickly, like he was ashamed of something he wasn't willing to name. He told himself I was strong enough to handle it. He told himself Shelby would fall apart without the protection. What he never told himself, as far as I could see, was that choosing silence when someone is being treated unfairly is still a choice, and it still has a cost. I left for college with a scholarship and a quiet private relief that I didn't fully understand at the time. I studied hospitality management, threw myself into every course and internship I could find, and graduated with an offer from a large hotel group in New York, the kind of position most people in my program would have accepted without a second thought. I came home for a holiday visit that year and found Harborstone Inn in worse shape than I'd ever seen it. My father had made a series of investments that hadn't paid off. My mother had been spending inn revenue on charity galas and social memberships that kept her in the right circles. And Shelby had just launched a company called Golden Veil Events, using the inn's banquet hall as her office, her showroom, and her personal entertainment space without paying a cent for any of it. I turned down the New York offer. I told myself it was because I loved the inn, because Beatrice had built something worth saving, because the staff, many of whom had worked there for decades, deserved better than to lose their jobs because of decisions they hadn't made. All of that was true. But I think part of me also turned it down because I had been trained for my entire childhood to believe that my opportunities were negotiable and my family's needs were not. The next several years were the hardest I'd ever worked. I renegotiated the inn's debt, restructured how we managed bookings and staffing, rebuilt relationships with vendors who had stopped trusting us, and slowly, carefully brought Harborstone back to a place where it could sustain itself. I did most of this while Shelby used our event spaces for her clients, borrowed our staff for her setups, and billed expenses to accounts I hadn't approved. Every time I raised the issue, my mother had the same response: "She's still building her business. You're already successful. Help her." I heard that sentence so many times it stopped sounding like a request and started sounding like a law. Dominic Hale came into the picture because a major storm had damaged the inn's dock and seawall, and we needed a coastal engineer with serious credentials to assess the structural risk before we could reopen the waterfront. He came highly recommended, showed up exactly on time, and gave me an assessment that was thorough, honest, and unusually for someone in a position to charge whatever they wanted, priced fairly. He was direct without being blunt, confident without being dismissive. I noticed him. I just didn't do anything about it because I had other things to manage, and because Shelby had noticed him first. She made that clear at his very first site presentation. She was charming and attentive in the way she always was when she wanted something, and she followed up that meeting with an invitation to dinner, then to a cocktail event she was hosting, then to a private tasting she'd organized at the inn. Dominic declined each time politely and without drama. He simply didn't engage beyond the professional, and Shelby eventually stopped pushing, at least visibly. What I didn't know then was that she hadn't stopped wanting. She'd just started waiting. Dominic and I began working closely together over the following months. He was overseeing the dock reconstruction, which required constant coordination with my operational schedule, and we fell into an easy rhythm of early morning walkthroughs and end-of-day check-ins. I noticed that he listened when I talked. Really listened, not the way people do when they're waiting for their turn to speak, but the way someone does when they're genuinely trying to understand. He noticed things about the inn that I had stopped seeing because I was too close to them. He noticed things about me too, I think, though it took him a while to say so. I was honest with him from the beginning about my hesitation. I told him Shelby had expressed interest and that I didn't want to create a situation that would complicate things. He looked at me steadily and said that he had never given Shelby any reason to believe there was something between them, that he had been consistent and professional, and that he wasn't going to make his choices based on her expectations. He said it the way he said most things, simply without performance. It was one of the first times in my adult life that someone had told me my sister's feelings didn't automatically override mine. We were together for nearly 2 years before he proposed. He did it at the newly finished dock on a clear evening in late October, when the water was still and the lights from Annapolis were just visible across the bay. It wasn't elaborate. It didn't need to be. He knew I wasn't someone who needed a production. I needed something real, and that was exactly what he gave me. Shelby found out within a week. I don't know who told her. It may have been someone on staff, or my mother may have seen the ring and shared the news before I had a chance to do it myself. What I do know is that by the time I sat down with my parents to tell them formally, Shelby had already spent several days crying in my mother's kitchen, declaring that she had loved Dominic from the beginning and that I had known and pursued him anyway. My mother absorbed this version of events without question. She called me that evening, and her opening line was not congratulations. It was, "Did you know how your sister felt?" I told her that Shelby's feelings for someone who had never reciprocated them didn't give her ownership of that person. My mother was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You're the older one, Natalie. You could find someone else. She's more fragile than you are." I had heard versions of that sentence my entire life, but hearing it applied to my engagement to the first relationship I had ever built slowly, honestly, without apology, was something different. It wasn't just unfair. It was a kind of violence. A few days before Thanksgiving, I found an envelope in my desk drawer that I hadn't noticed before. One of the longtime staff members told me quietly that Miss Beatrice had asked her to hold it and give it to me when the time seemed right. Inside was a small card in my grandmother's handwriting, along with a business card for a man named Arthur Wynne, her attorney. The card said, "If they don't let you speak, call Arthur. He knows what to do." I didn't fully understand what she meant, but I called him anyway, standing in the parking lot of the inn on a cold November afternoon, feeling like I was doing something I couldn't explain and couldn't ignore. Arthur picked up on the second ring. He told me Beatrice had left him specific instructions. He told me to let him know if I needed him and that he would come. I didn't tell anyone about the call. My father phoned 2 days later and said the family wanted to have a real conversation at Thanksgiving, something calm, something where everyone could sit down together and talk through the situation like adults. He said he just wanted peace. He sounded tired and a little ashamed, and I believed him because I had always believed him when he said things like that. I told Dominic about the dinner. He said he'd come with me, that he wasn't going to let me walk into that alone. I held on to that. We arrived at Harborstone Inn on Thanksgiving evening to find the banquet hall arranged the way I had seen it arranged for formal events, long table candles, every chair occupied. The moment I stepped through the door, something in the air told me this was not a conversation. The seating had been arranged so that Dominic and I were at one end, and the rest of the family formed a single mass at the other. My mother sat at the center. Shelby sat beside her. My father sat at the head of the table with a stack of papers in front of him that he didn't open when I walked in. Before the main course was even served, one of my aunts closed the door behind us. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years reached across and took my phone, saying he didn't want the evening to end up online. I let him take it because I didn't yet understand what was happening, and by the time I did, the door was already closed, and my mother was already pushing the engagement cancellation form across the table toward me. She told me my little sister needed Dominic more than I did. She told me I was strong enough to start over. She said Shelby wouldn't survive losing him. And as she said it, I looked around the table at every face I had known my entire life, the same people who had called me when the inn's pipes burst in February, who had borrowed money I never asked to have, returned, who had toasted my name at every family gathering as the one who kept everything together. And I understood that none of them were here to listen to me. They had already decided. The only thing left was to make me comply. Dominic stood up. My mother told him to sit down. Said this was a family matter. Said he didn't understand the history between her daughters. He stayed standing. My father still hadn't looked at me. I thought about the phone I no longer had. I thought about the door that was closed. I thought about Arthur Wynne sitting somewhere on the other side of this night, waiting for a message that I could no longer send from my own phone. And then I remembered that Dominic had his. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I reached into my bag and set my grandmother's wooden box on the center of the table. The brass lock caught the candlelight. My mother's face went white in a way that had nothing to do with shock and everything to do with recognition. She knew what that box was. She had known it existed, and she had spent years hoping I would never find it. No one at that table moved. My mother's eyes were fixed on the wooden box, the way someone stares at a thing they hoped had been lost for good. She told me to put it away. She said my grandmother had been elderly confused in her final years, and that whatever was inside that box was the product of a mind that had already started failing. My father added that this wasn't the moment to bring up finances, that we were here to talk about family, not paperwork. They both spoke quickly, one after the other, and the speed of it told me everything they knew, exactly what Beatrice had left behind. And they had spent a long time hoping I'd never find it. I opened the box anyway. Beatrice's letter was written in the careful, deliberate handwriting she'd kept all her life, the kind of penmanship that belongs to a generation that understood permanence. She wrote that she had watched me carry things I should never have been asked to carry, and that she had stayed quiet too many times out of a misguided hope that the family would eventually correct itself. She wrote that she was sorry for every moment she had chosen peace over honesty, and that what she was leaving in the box was her attempt to make it right before she no longer could. Beneath the letter was a portable hard drive and a set of printed financial reports, 3 years of Harborstone Inn's accounts annotated in red. The reports showed that over $412,000 had been moved out of the inn's renovation and maintenance fund across 37 months. The transfers were broken into amounts small enough to avoid automatic review, routed first through an internal operational account and then out to Golden Vale events. The money had paid for things that had nothing to do with the inn: Shelby's personal credit card debt, a luxury rental car she'd kept for 14 months, a failed promotional event she'd thrown at a rooftop venue in Georgetown, a deposit on a Washington, D.C. office space she'd never actually opened, and legal fees from a lawsuit a former client had filed against her company 2 years prior. My name appeared on the authorization forms for every single transfer. My signature, or something close enough to it that a casual reader wouldn't notice, had been used to make each one look approved. I had never signed any of them. The room went quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet before. Not the aggressive silence of people waiting to argue, but something heavier, the silence of people who were beginning to understand that they had been brought here under false pretenses. I watched one of my aunts set her fork down. I watched a cousin who had been leaning back in his chair straighten up slowly. No one looked at Shelby. No one looked at me either. They looked at the table or at their hands, or at some neutral point in the middle distance, the way people do when they're trying to process something they don't yet want to accept. My mother was the one who broke it. She told me I was humiliating Shelby in front of the entire family, that I had brought confidential documents to a holiday dinner like a weapon, and that a real sister would have handled something like this privately. She said it with the full force of someone who had rehearsed the argument, and I realized she had, because she'd known this moment was possible. She'd known what the box contained, which meant she had known about the transfers, which meant the outrage on her face was not genuine surprise. It was a performance, and not a very good one. Some of the relatives still defended Shelby. One of my uncles said she was young, still learning, and that I should be helping her rather than exposing her. I told him Shelby was 31 years old, that she had founded and operated a company, and that she understood exactly what forging a signature meant. I said it without raising my voice because I didn't need to raise my voice. The documents said everything louder than I could. Then Shelby stood up. She wasn't crying anymore. She'd moved past tears into something colder, more deliberate. She said, "The money is one thing, but Dominic is the man I love. And you knew that, Natalie. You knew it, and you went after him anyway." It was a calculated move. She was trying to drag the room back to the story she'd already told them, the version where I was a jealous older sister who had stolen something that belonged to her. She still had her phone. She held it up and started laying the screenshots across the table, one by one, physical printouts she'd prepared in advance, each one showing a conversation between her and someone identified as Dominic, messages about feelings, about timing, about waiting for the right moment. Dominic asked if he could speak. My mother told him this was a matter between sisters and that he should stay out of it. He spoke anyway. He said the phone number in those screenshots was not his. He said the profile photo had been taken directly from the Hale Marine Design Company website. It was a headshot used on the team page publicly available to anyone. He said the writing style in those messages bore no resemblance to how he communicated, and that anyone who had ever received a text from him would notice the difference immediately. Then he opened his own laptop, which he'd brought in his bag, and connected it to the projector system mounted at the far end of the banquet hall, the same system I'd had installed 2 years ago for corporate events. The screen at the back of the room filled with light. What he showed the family were emails. Real ones with full headers and timestamps. Shelby had contacted him professionally multiple times, and the subject of those emails had nothing to do with love. She had proposed a business arrangement in which Dominic would advocate for Golden Vale Events to become the exclusive event coordination partner for the inn's planned expansion. In exchange, she had promised him that Raymond and Patricia would direct future construction contracts toward Hale Marine Design. Dominic had declined in writing, explaining that he didn't conduct business that way and that any vendor relationships at Harborstone Inn were Natalie's decision to make. Shelby had not replied to that email. Then he played a voice message. Shelby's voice came through the laptop speakers clearly enough that everyone in the room could hear it. She had sent it to him after he had declined her proposal, and after he had told her he was planning to propose to me. Her voice was calm, almost businesslike. She said, "Natalie always does what the family asks. She's my older sister, eventually. They'll make her give you back. By Thanksgiving, my parents will have handled it." He also had a purchase receipt showing that the phone number used to create the fake messaging account had been bought using a Golden Vale Events business card. The room that had been uncomfortable before was now something else entirely. A cousin near the end of the table, the same one who had taken my phone at the start of the evening, quietly stood up and placed it back in front of me without being asked. An aunt I'd known my whole life pressed her fingers to her mouth and looked at Shelby with an expression I had never seen her wear before. Dominic looked at my sister directly and said that he had never dated her, never loved her, never made her any promises, and that her wanting him did not create any obligation on his part or on mine. Then he turned to the rest of the table and said, "You're not asking Natalie to fix a mistake. You're asking her to hand me over to her sister like I'm something an older sibling is supposed to give up." I watched my father's face during all of this. He hadn't spoken in several minutes, which was unusual even for him. One of my cousins leaned toward him and asked quietly, but not quietly enough, whether he had known the screenshots were fabricated. Raymond didn't answer right away. The delay was its own kind of answer. I kept reading through the documents while the room was still processing what it had just heard, and what I found in the final section of Beatrice's papers explained the delay. Explained, in fact, why my parents had been willing to organize this entire evening around a story that didn't hold together. Harborstone Inn was carrying a loan that was coming due in less than 90 days. The amount was significant enough that if we couldn't secure new financing, the bank had the right to take over the dock and the waterfront event space, the two areas that Dominic had spent the better part of a year restoring. At the same time, Hale Marine Design had been shortlisted for a major coastal redevelopment contract worth tens of millions of dollars. My mother had done the math in the simplest possible way. If Shelby married Dominic, the family would have access to his financial standing, his professional reputation, and his industry relationships. That access would make it far easier to refinance the inn's debt. A marriage between Shelby and Dominic wasn't just something my mother wanted for sentimental reasons. It was a financial strategy. My father finally spoke. He said he had not been certain the screenshots were real. He said Patricia had told him that even if the specific messages were exaggerated, Shelby's feelings were genuine, and that Natalie was resilient enough to understand. He said he had told himself that Dominic might come to see the practical advantages of aligning himself with the Crowley family once things settled. He said these things in a quiet, careful voice, looking at the table rather than at me, and every sentence landed like something I had already known, but had never allowed myself to fully believe. He hadn't been deceived into this evening. He had walked into it with enough doubt to know better, and had chosen to proceed because it was easier than protecting me. Some of the relatives began to shift visibly. A few said they hadn't been told about the debt, or about the business emails, or about the fact that my father had questions about the screenshots before tonight. But there were still others, fewer now, but still present, who said that I should consider what was best for the whole family. One of them said Shelby had the most to lose, and that I was in a stronger position to absorb a setback. It was the same logic my mother had used my entire life, dressed up in the language of practicality. I was strong, therefore I could be hurt. Shelby was fragile, therefore she had to be protected. The circularity of it was so complete that no evidence could break through it, because the conclusion wasn't based on evidence in the first place. Then Shelby did something none of us expected. She stopped performing. She stood up, and when she spoke this time, there was no tremor in her voice. She admitted she had created the fake messages. She didn't frame it as a confession, she framed it as a symptom. She said she had spent her entire life watching me be chosen by our grandmother, by the staff, by every person who walked into the inn and needed someone reliable. She said I had a career, a reputation, a building full of people who respected me, and a man who loved me, and that asking me to let go of one of those things was not cruelty, it was math. She said I didn't actually need Dominic the way she did, because I had always been able to take care of myself, and she never had. There was a kind of terrible logic to the way she said it. Not because it was right, but because it was exactly what my family had believed about me my whole life, that my capability was a resource to be drawn from, not a quality to be respected. My mother took a long breath and looked at me. Your sister made a mistake because she was desperate. But you're the older one. You're the one who can end this tonight. Walk away from Dominic, and we go back to normal. I asked her what normal looked like, whether it was the version where Shelby makes the mistake and I pay the price. She didn't answer. Instead, she called for a vote. She asked everyone at the table to raise their hand if they believed Natalie should step back from her role in managing Harborstone Inn until she agreed to reconsider the engagement. Most hands went up. My father reached for his phone and quietly removed my access credentials from the inn's management system. My mother lifted the name card from my place setting and turned it face down on the table. Then she asked the security staff member standing near the door to escort Dominic and me out. Shelby reached across the table, grabbed Beatrice's letter, and tore it in half. She said that people who were gone no longer had the right to decide anything for the living. I had proven every material fact I needed to prove. I had shown them the money, then shown them the fake account, shown them the emails, let Dominic speak for himself. And the family had looked at all of it and still chosen her, not because they believed she was right, but because choosing her was easier than admitting what they had been doing to me for 35 years. Dominic looked at me. I picked up my phone from the table and typed one word to Arthur Wynne. Now, Arthur Wynne was 63 years old and had the kind of stillness about him that comes from decades of walking into rooms where people are saying things they will later regret. He appeared at the banquet hall door less than 4 minutes after I sent the message, which meant he had been in the building the entire evening, waiting exactly as he had promised. He was carrying a leather document case, and he didn't knock. He simply opened the door, stepped inside, and looked at the room with the calm, unhurried expression of someone who already knew what he was going to find. My mother told him he wasn't welcome. She said this was a private family matter, and that he had no business being here. Arthur agreed that it was a family matter. Then he set his document case on the table, opened it, and placed a bound copy of Harborstone Inn's trust documents in front of Raymond at the head of the table. He explained what those documents said in plain, measured language, the way a person speaks when they want to make certain no one in the room can claim they misunderstood. Beatrice Crowley had never transferred outright ownership of Harborstone Inn to Raymond. The inn had been placed inside a conditional trust decades ago, and Raymond and Patricia had been granted management authority, not ownership, subject to a specific set of requirements. Those requirements included protecting the inn's assets, refraining from using inn funds for personal benefit, maintaining accurate records without falsification, treating both named beneficiaries equitably, and never using coercion or family pressure to remove either beneficiary from her rightful position. Violating any one of those conditions was grounds for an automatic transfer of control to the next named beneficiary. Violating several of them simultaneously, as had occurred tonight and over the past 3 years, triggered an immediate and irrevocable transfer. The next named beneficiary was me. Arthur had already filed the paperwork that afternoon. The transfer was not pending, it had already taken effect. The vote my mother had called the credential removal my father had executed from his phone. The name card she had turned face down on the table, none of it had any legal weight. The inn had already changed hands before the turkey was carved. Raymond looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. My mother looked at me instead, and what I saw in her expression was not guilt. It was recalculation. She was already thinking about what argument came next, which angle still had leverage, which version of the story she could still use. She said, "Natalie, think about what you're doing to this family." I thought about it. I thought about it the way she had never thought about what she was doing to me, carefully, with full awareness of the consequences, eyes open. My mother asked me to remember who had raised me, who had given me my first understanding of what the inn meant, who had sacrificed to keep the family together. I noticed she did not mention Beatrice, who had actually taught me to read a balance sheet and walk the corridors with care. She mentioned herself. My father put his hand on the table and said that Shelby was still young, that a criminal record would destroy her, that surely I could find a way to handle this quietly within the family, the way these things were supposed to be handled. Shelby said nothing at first. She sat with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and then she said that Beatrice had always favored me, that the trust was just our grandmother's way of punishing her from beyond the grave, that I had probably known about it for years and had maneuvered the whole evening to make it look like her fault. I let her finish. There was nothing in what she said that required a response, because everyone in that room had just watched the evening unfold, and the sequence of events was not something that could be reframed by asserting it loudly enough. Dominic had not said anything since Arthur arrived. He was standing slightly behind me and to my left, close enough to make clear he wasn't going anywhere, far enough back to make clear this was my moment to handle. At some point, he caught my eye, and he said quietly, "You don't need to fight to keep me. I already chose you. The only thing you have to decide tonight is whether you're going to keep letting them choose for you." It was the right thing to say, and he knew it wasn't advice, it was a reminder. I had already made the decision. I just needed to hear myself reflected back clearly before I acted on it. I told Arthur to proceed with the full transfer documentation and to schedule an independent audit of the inn's accounts for the following week. I told him I wanted a forensic accounting firm, not anyone who had worked with the inn previously, to go through every transaction from the past 4 years. Then I turned to the table and spoke to the room, not just to my parents or to Shelby, but to everyone who had been sitting there since before the food was served. I said that I was not going to arrest anyone tonight. I was not going to call the police from the parking lot or issue press statements or do any of the things that the anger I was feeling might have justified. What I was going to do was exactly what the trust required me to do: protect the inn, protect the staff, and make certain that the people who had caused the damage were no longer in a position to cause more. Effective immediately, Raymond and Patricia were suspended from all management functions pending the outcome of the audit. Golden Vale Events had 30 days to vacate the inn's premises entirely: the office space, the storage rooms, the equipment, all of it. Shelby had two options. She could sign a repayment agreement for the full $412,000, plus a portion of the operational losses her actions had caused on a structured schedule that Arthur would prepare. Or she could decline to sign, in which case the audit findings would be referred to the state attorney's office, and the matter of the forged signatures would be handled through the legal system rather than within the family. I told her she had 72 hours to decide. I gave my parents 60 days to make arrangements to relocate from the residential wing of the property. I was not putting them on the street in December, but I was also not allowing them to continue living inside a building they had spent 3 years quietly draining, as though nothing had changed. I made clear to Arthur that the staff were to be protected in full. Their contracts, their wages, their positions, none of it would be affected by what had happened tonight. They had done their jobs. Whatever was broken in the Crowley family was not something they should pay for. Several relatives began to gather their coats. A few of them stopped on their way to the door. One of my aunts took my hand and said she was sorry, not just for tonight, but she said it in a way that included a lot of other nights, and I understood what she meant. I told her that what she could do going forward was not assume she already knew a story just because one person had spent weeks telling it to her. She nodded and didn't say anything else, which was the right response. My father called me the following week. He had started seeing a therapist, he said, someone recommended by a colleague. He told me that for most of my life he had comforted himself with the idea that calling me strong was a compliment. He said he understood now that it had been an excuse, that every time he told himself, Natalie can handle it, he was choosing not to handle it himself, and leaving me to absorb whatever the family couldn't or wouldn't deal with. He said he knew that understanding something and being forgiven for it were two different things, and that he wasn't calling to ask for forgiveness. He was calling because he thought I should know that he saw it. I told him I heard him, and that seeing it was a start, and that I would need time. He said he understood. We left it there. My mother sent a text 3 weeks later. It said, "You're the older one, Natalie. You should be the one to bring this family back together." I read it twice, set my phone down on the kitchen counter, and made coffee. I wasn't angry when I read it. I wasn't even particularly surprised. It was the same sentence she had been sending me in one form or another for 35 years, and the fact that she could send it now after everything that had happened in that banquet hall told me something I had been circling. For most of my life, she was never going to change because she had never accepted that there was anything to change. She believed the sentence was true. She would always believe it. And I had finally, at 35 years old, reached the point where I understood that I did not need her to stop believing it in order for me to stop complying with it. I didn't reply. Shelby signed the repayment agreement within the 72 hours. She liquidated her car, closed the Washington, D.C. deposit account, and began making monthly payments. Golden Vale Events shut down formally 2 weeks after she vacated the inn's premises. I don't know what she did after that. I know she didn't call me, and I didn't call her either. There was nothing between us that a phone call could repair, and I had spent too many years trying to repair things that had never been intact to begin with. Dominic and I got married in March at the dock he had rebuilt. It was a small ceremony, a dozen people, the kind of late winter afternoon on the Chesapeake, where the light comes in low and golden across the water, and everything looks like it's been cleaned by the cold. I wore something simple. There were no assigned seats, no formal program, no one walking me down an aisle. We stood at the end of the dock and said what we wanted to say to each other, and the people who were there were people who had earned the right to witness it. The following Thanksgiving was the first one I had organized entirely on my own terms. I opened the inn's banquet hall the way I had always privately wanted to, not for a family gathering, but for the community. Staff members brought their families. A local organization that worked with military families in the area sent 20 guests. A church group that ran a meal program for elderly residents without family nearby sent 12 more. The long table that had been arranged like a tribunal the year before was covered end to end with food and noise and the kind of unpolished laughter that comes from people who aren't performing for each other. Raymond was there. He came early and offered to help set up, and I let him not as a gesture of forgiveness exactly, but as an acknowledgement that he was doing the work and that I was willing to see it. He sat with the kitchen staff during dinner, not at the head of the table, and he didn't try to reclaim any authority or position. He just ate and listened and helped clear plates when the meal was over. It wasn't redemption. It was a beginning, and I was careful not to confuse the two. Before everyone arrived, I placed a framed photograph of Beatrice on the windowsill, beside the banquet hall's main entrance. The same window that looked out over the dock, over the bay, over the stretch of water she had looked at every morning for most of her life. Next to the photograph, I set the two torn halves of her letter carefully taped back together. The tape was visible. I left it that way on purpose. Some things that get broken can be repaired, and the repair doesn't need to be hidden to be real. She had written near the end of the letter, "Being a sister does not mean giving your life to someone else so they can live it. The people who truly love you will never ask you to disappear so they can shine." I had read those lines so many times in the months since Thanksgiving that I no longer needed the paper to remember them. But I wanted them in the room. I wanted them where I could see them from my seat at the table. The bay outside was gray and cold, the way it always is in late November, the water moving in slow, heavy swells that had traveled a long way to reach the shore. Inside, the room was warm and loud, and full of people who had no obligation to each other except the one they had chosen to show up. I looked at Dominic across the table. I looked at the staff members who had stayed through all of it, through the debt, and the arguments, and the long, uncertain months, because they believed the inn was worth staying for. I looked at the empty chair at the head of the table which I had left empty on purpose, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, not triumph, not relief exactly, but a kind of solid, quiet settledness that I recognized as the feeling of finally being in the right place. A year earlier, I had walked into this room believing I was about to lose something. What I had actually lost was the role of the older one, the strong one, the one who absorbs and endures and makes room for everyone else's happiness at the cost of her own. I had carried that role for so long, I had confused it with my identity. Losing it felt at first like losing myself. But sitting at that table on a cold November evening, in a room full of people I had chosen, and who had chosen me back, I understood that it had never been me at all. It had just been what they needed me to be. And I had finally at 35 decided that was no longer enough of a reason. Being the responsible one, the capable one, the one who always holds everything together, that was never supposed to mean you have no right to a life of your own. If this story resonated with you, I'd love for you to subscribe and stay for the next one. Every week I share stories about people who stopped shrinking themselves to fit the space their families assigned them, and what happened when they finally didn't. I'll see you there.